Pope Leo XIV raised his hand and stopped the dedication before the choir had finished its opening line. Two ushers were guiding an old woman toward a side door, and in her arms she carried a small wooden sign, its paint cracked and its edges worn soft by 40 winners. She was not resisting. She only kept whispering that she was sorry, that she had not meant to be a bother, that they could carry on without her. Her name was Eleanor Brady. She was 79 years old. For 4 decades, she had run the winter shelter and the evening soup line at St. Bernadette's Parish in a quiet corner of Ohio. Her late husband, Thomas, had built that shelter with his own hands. The tables, the shelves, the long benches, and above its door he had hung a plain wooden sign he painted one Christmas. "There is always room." Eleanor had spent more nights in that shelter than in her own living room. But that shelter had been locked for 9 weeks. The soup line was gone. The volunteers had been sent home, and the man who had closed it, Father Victor Hale, was about to unveil what he called the parish's new retreat and conference center, a blessing scheduled for 7 o'clock that same evening, with the Pope himself invited to bless it. No one had told Pope Leo XIV that Eleanor Brady had been quietly removed from the parish council. No one had told him she had been accused of confusing sentiment with stewardship. He simply saw an old woman being walked out of a church, clutching a painted board to her coat, and he saw that not one person in that room would look at her directly. "Why is she leaving?" he asked. Father Hale stepped down from the sanctuary with the easy confidence of a man used to answering hard questions before they turned dangerous. "Holy Father, Mrs. Brady has been unwell. We thought it kinder to let her rest." Eleanor lowered her eyes. "I did not mean to interrupt," she said softly. "I only asked where the shelter money had gone." The church went so quiet that the organist lifted his hands off the keys. Pope Leo XIV looked at the sign in her arms. He walked down the aisle and he asked if he might see it. She gave it to him with both hands, the way you hand someone a child. He turned it over. On the back, in a careful, old-fashioned hand, were 4 words burned into the wood. "For anyone who's cold." He read them twice. Then he looked at Father Hale. "What shelter money?" he asked. Hale smiled patiently. "The parish has gone through a difficult but necessary restructuring, Holy Father. Some of our older members have found the changes hard." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the empty air where the sign had been. "My Thomas left money for that shelter," she said. "So did others. I only asked where it went." Hale turned toward the congregation as if to shield them from an unpleasant family quarrel. "Nothing was stolen. The funds were redirected into a long-term parish asset." A long-term parish asset. The phrase seemed to change the temperature of the room. The Pope handed the sign back to Eleanor. "The dedication will wait," he said. And within minutes the great doors were closed, the cameras switched off, and Father Hale was asked to bring every record connected to the shelter into the new center. Hale did not look afraid. He looked insulted. He believed his documents would defend him. What he did not yet know was that the Pope had already caught one detail that no honest account could explain. The shelter had been shut for lack of funds. The new center had a heated indoor pool. Father Victor Hale had led St. Bernadette's for 11 years. He was careful with words and admired by wealthy families. He had fixed the roof, filled the school, and brought money back to a dying parish. And when he spoke about the future, people leaned in. His favorite phrase was simple, and he used it now, in the finance office, as heavy binders were laid across a long table. "A parish," he said, "must think beyond next winter." The property was not in his name. It belonged to the St. Bernadette Legacy Trust, formed 18 months earlier. The purchase price had been $1,100,000, plus $86,000 more for furniture, iron gates, landscaping, and a private chapel. The annual cost of the shelter he had closed had been $22,000. Hale pointed to the larger number as though it proved wisdom rather than exposed it. "The property is an investment," he explained. "It will host clergy retreats, donor gatherings, spiritual conferences. In time, it will support every ministry we have." Pope Leo XIV turned a page. The house had 6 bedrooms, a sauna, a wine room, the pool, and a 3-car garage. There was no retreat schedule, no rental plan, no accessibility survey for the elderly. There was, however, a standing invoice for a private chef, 2 evenings a week. "Who lives there?" the Pope asked. "No one permanently." "Who sleeps there?" Hale paused. "I do, when parish matters require quiet." "Who keeps clothes there?" "A few things, for convenience." The diocesan finance officer, a careful man named Gerald Pratt, said the trust had been reviewed, that circumstances had changed, that no one had personally pocketed a single dollar. The Pope listened without interrupting. Then he asked to see the original donor restrictions. That was when the air in the room changed. Some gifts had been general, others had not. Thomas Brady had left $160,000 with one condition written in his own hand, that it keep the shelter open and warm for those who had nowhere else to sleep. 3 other elderly parishioners had added smaller gifts under the same condition. A retired railway man named Arthur Doyle had given the payout from his life insurance. A widow named Ruth Hensley had donated the money from selling her late husband's tools. Every one of those gifts had gone into a restricted account, and 6 months later, that account had been emptied in a single transfer into the Legacy Trust. Gerald Pratt took off his glasses and cleaned lenses that were already clean. Hale stayed composed. The donors wanted this parish to survive, he said. A parish that cannot attract serious support cannot help anyone. Eleanor sat against the wall, the painted sign on her lap. The Pope turned to her. Were you told this money would buy a house? No. Were the others told? 2 of them died before the shelter even closed. Hale leaned forward. With respect, Holy Father, sentiment cannot govern every financial decision. We did what was prudent. There it was. The clean explanation. No theft, no suitcase of cash, no forged name. Only authorized decisions, approved by people who had never once sat across a table from the men and women who lost their beds. The establishment still believed the whole thing could be managed. Hale offered to reopen the shelter 1 night a week. Pratt suggested a committee. A lawyer proposed postponing the dedication. Pope Leo XIV said nothing to any of it. He turned to Eleanor. Would you take me to the shelter? It smelled of dust and cold iron and the lemon cleaner she still used, though no one had slept there in 9 weeks. Eleanor carried the old key on a faded blue ribbon around her wrist. The locks had been changed, but one back door still gave to it. Inside, the cots were folded against the wall, the blankets sealed in plastic, the big kettle unplugged and dry. On the corkboard, the schedule from the last week still hung. Monday, stew. Wednesday, soup and bread. Friday, fish and a coat for Danny if his tears again. Eleanor took off her coat, folded it over a chair, and, without seeming to notice she was doing it, reached over and checked that the stove knobs were turned off. You still come here, the Pope said. Why? The canned food shouldn't sit too long, she answered. The room had been taken from her, and still she cared for it. In a cupboard she showed him containers labeled in her handwriting for the people who used to come. No salt, Walter. Soft food. Mrs. Okafor. Extra roll, Sam. He keeps half for morning. The Pope lifted one. Where are they eating now? Eleanor answered slowly. Some go to the county van. Some won't open the door to strangers. 3 have stopped answering my calls. Then the shelter's old bookkeeper arrived, a woman named Carol Winters, who had kept her own copies of the receipts after Hale let her go for resisting consolidation. Carol laid it out plainly. The shelter had not been failing. The food was donated. The labor was volunteer. The $22,000 covered heat, water, and supplies, nothing more. The shelter had not been closed because the parish had run out of money. It had been closed because Hale wanted that wing emptied so the building could be listed for private rental. That was the second layer. The mansion had not only swallowed the poor's money, the poor's shelter itself was being turned into a space to be rented out. Pope Leo XIV asked to see the auction list for the shelter's contents. Near the bottom, in a line Eleanor had never seen, was written, Item 61, hand-painted wooden sign, shelter door. Estimated value, $15. The sign in her arms had already been entered for sale. She sat down for the first time all day. She did not curse Father Hale. My Thomas painted that, she said quietly. He hung it the first winter, when the boys had nowhere to go. The Pope turned the sign over again. Beneath the 4 burned words, almost worn away, were smaller ones he had missed before. Victor, leave it open. If someone comes to your mind right now, someone whose quiet kindness the world forgot, write their name in the comments, and let that name be seen and prayed for tonight. The Pope asked Carol whether any records survived from those early years. She opened the old parish album and found a photograph. A boy of perhaps 16, thin, in a coat 2 sizes too big, sitting at the shelter table between Thomas and Eleanor Brady, a bowl of stew in front of him and a shy smile on his face. On the back, in Eleanor's writing, "Victor's first winter with us." Victor Hale had been that boy. His mother had worked nights and then not been able to work at all. For 2 winters he had slept in the Brady shelter and eaten at the Brady table. Thomas had paid for part of his final year of seminary. Eleanor had pressed his one good shirt the morning he was ordained. And after his first Mass, standing in that same shelter, Father Victor Hale had promised out loud that as long as he lived, no one in that town would sleep in the cold. Now his own private house had a heated pool, and the shelter that had once kept him alive was listed, item by item, for sale. By 2:40 that afternoon, the Pope had the mansion's occupancy records, its utility bills, its guest calendar. In 6 months, Father Hale had slept there 81 nights. Only 2 formal retreats had ever taken place, both attended by the same wealthy donors who later paid for the landscaping and the wine. By 4 o'clock, the housekeeper, a patient woman named Rosa, confirmed that 1 bedroom was his private suite. His initials were stitched into the towels. The staff, she said, called it the residence when donors weren't there, and the retreat center when they were. Hale still insisted the arrangement was temporary. Pope Leo XIV asked one more question. "Where is the private chapel?" Rosa's eyes moved to the painted sign in Eleanor's arms. "There's a crucifix above the little altar," she said. "Thomas Brady made that one too." Eleanor's face changed. Thomas had carved a cross as an ordination gift for the boy he'd fed, and Victor Hale had carried it into the mansion and hung it over a marble altar in a house built by taking the shelter from the very people it was meant to warm. At 5:10, Pope Leo XIV made his decision. The dedication would not be canceled. It would go ahead, exactly as planned. Every donor, every council member, every diocesan official, every local reporter who had been invited would be let in. But before Father Hale blessed a single wall, Eleanor Brady would walk in first carrying the sign, and no one would leave until one question had been answered out loud in front of the very people whose money had built the place. The iron gates opened at 6:45. Guests passed a stone fountain and a brass plaque that read St. Bernadette Renewal House, while servers carried silver trays through rooms larger than the parish hall. Father Hale wore a black suit and his Roman collar and greeted the donors calmly, but the cord stood out in his neck when the Pope arrived with Eleanor at his side. She wore the same gray coat, the old key on its ribbon, the painted sign held against her chest. Hale crossed to him quickly. "Holy Father, I fear a public setting could cause unnecessary scandal." "The scandal is already here," Pope Leo XIV said. "We are only deciding where the truth walks into it." At 7, the guests gathered in the great salon. Hale stepped toward a small platform to speak about vision and renewal and the future. The Pope raised one hand. "Before the blessing," he said, "I have one question." Hale's prepared smile faltered. The Pope gestured to the high ceiling, the pool glittering beyond the glass doors, the long table set for 40. "Who paid for this house?" "The St. Bernadette Legacy Trust," Hale answered at once. The Pope did not move. "Who paid for it?" "Parish funds were lawfully transferred." Pope Leo XIV turned to Eleanor. She stepped forward and set the small painted sign down on the polished marble table. It looked almost absurd there, its cracked paint and worn edges against all that stone. Then Carol Winters read the names of the restricted donors, one by one: Thomas Brady, Arthur Doyle, Ruth Hensley, Walter Sims, Mrs. Okafor. With each name, someone in that glittering room recognized a face, a funeral, an empty pew. The Pope asked Hale to repeat his defense. "A parish must think beyond next winter," Hale began, but the certainty had gone out of his voice. Pope Leo XIV walked to the private chapel, and the guests followed. Above the little altar hung the cross Thomas Brady had carved for a hungry boy. The Pope lifted it down, carried it back into the salon, and set it beside the painted sign. One had been made for a homeless child. One had been hung over a door for the cold. Both had ended up inside a mansion bought by taking the warmth from the people they were meant for. He looked at Father Hale. "Did you sleep in that shelter as a boy?" Hale stared at the sign. "Yes." "Did the Bradys feed you?" Yes. Did you tell his widow before you moved his gift what her husband had asked? No. Hale reached for the edge of the table. I believed I could build something larger, something that would secure this parish for generations. Eleanor spoke without anger. You already had something that kept people warm. That was the sentence that ended his defense. Not the audit, not the price, not the initials on the towels. A widow reminding him that the work he had thrown away had already been holy. Pope Leo XIV did not shout, and he did not turn the room into a punishment. He asked the priest to look at Eleanor and tell her, in his own words, what her husband's money had bought. Hale's lips moved, but nothing came. The Pope waited. At last Hale said it. It bought this house. And what did it close? The shelter. And what did you call her when she asked where it went? Hale shut his eyes, confused. The Pope stepped away from him and turned to the room. This house will not be blessed tonight as a private retreat. Beginning tomorrow, it passes to independent diocesan trustees. Its bedrooms will shelter elderly parishioners coming home from the hospital with no one to care for them. Its dining room will serve the meals that were taken away. Its grounds will belong to the people whose sacrifices paid for every stone, he went on. The shelter will reopen within 7 days. Every restricted gift will be restored through the sale of what is not needed here and through diocesan repayment. The trust will be dissolved. An independent audit will follow, and no one who signed these transfers will oversee it. Then he turned to Father Hale. You are removed from all financial authority, effective tonight. You will leave this house before the guests do. You will cooperate fully with the investigators of the church and of the state. And before you go, you will do one thing. Hale looked up. The Pope pointed to Eleanor. You will give her back her key. The lock had already been changed. It did not matter. Hale took the old brass shelter key from a file in his briefcase. He had kept it as proof that her access was revoked, and he placed it in Eleanor's open hand. She closed her fingers around it. I never wanted your house, she said. I wanted their supper. Hale nodded once. It was the first honest thing his body had done all day. And then the Pope did the thing no one in that room expected. He asked the servers to clear the engraved donor cards from the long dining table. He invited Eleanor to choose where she would sit, and he ordered the food, all of it, the silver trays, the untouched plates, carried out to the buses that had quietly pulled up at the gate, where the old men and women who once depended on that shelter were waiting in the cold. Within 20 minutes, the great dining room filled with walkers and canes, an oxygen tank, folded coats laid over the backs of velvet chairs, and voices that had not been in a warm room together in 9 weeks. Walter Sims sat beneath a chandelier worth more than every car he had ever owned. Mrs. Okafor touched the linen napkin as though someone might take it back. Eleanor did not sit at the head of the table. She moved from chair to chair, asking who needed their tea weak, who could not have salt, who wanted an extra roll for the morning. Pope Leo XIV watched her return, without a word of complaint to the work the world had called disposable. Then he carried the 2 pieces of wood into the dining room himself. He hung Thomas Brady's painted sign above the doorway, where every person entering would pass beneath, "There is always room," and the carved cross, the one made for a hungry boy, he set on the one empty chair, the chair where Father Hale had been meant to sit. No one mocked it. No one cheered a man's fall. The empty chair simply said, "Enough." 7 weeks later, the plaque on the iron gate was changed. It no longer read Renewal House. It read St. Martin's House, a place at the table. The pool became a therapy room. The wine cellar became a food pantry. The private suite became recovery rooms for the elderly, leaving the hospital alone. And the old shelter reopened. On the first Thursday, Eleanor arrived before dawn. The brass key still hung from its blue ribbon, though the new lock needed a different one, because some doors matter long after their keys stop turning. Above the stove, Thomas Brady's cross hung again, and steam slowly darkened its base the way it had for 40 years. And under the words he had carved so long ago, "For those who have no table," a new line had been added, small and fresh in the old wood. Their place was here all along. Now, before you go, if this story moved you, do one thing for me. Somewhere in your life there is an Eleanor. Someone who served quietly for years while everyone looked past them. Write their name in the comments and tell me the country you're watching from so we can honor them together because heaven never once looked past them. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the small, faithful work is the holy work. Pray with me in the comments. God bless you all. I love you, family. Stay faithful.